Caleb Morris lived a quiet life, believing that hard work and silence were enough to survive. One gloomy afternoon at the Riverton steel mill, police handcuffed him in front of dozens of black workers. A case stalled due to insufficient evidence. When will the truth be revealed? Does justice truly have eyes? Before we begin, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching today? And if you believe that some heroes are willing to look like criminals to save the innocent, then this story is for you. Morning came to Riverton under a sky the color of old steel. Low clouds pressed down on the city, trapping cold air between brick buildings and rusted streetlights. The wind carried the faint metallic smell of the steel plant, oil, iron dust, and something bitter that never quite left the town. Riverton had been built by hands like these, broken and scarred, and it showed in every cracked sidewalk and aging wall. Inside the Riverton courthouse, the air was still. Too still. The polished wooden floors reflected the overhead lights, and the American flag hung behind the judge's bench. Unmoving, ceremonial, untouched by the tension beneath it. That was where Caleb Morris stood. Caleb was 32 years old. A black factory worker of average height with a lean, hardened build shaped by years of physical labor. His shoulders sloped slightly forward, not from weakness but from habit, lifting steel, bending under weight, keeping his head down. His deep brown skin contrasted sharply with the pale wood around him. His face was narrow, defined by prominent cheekbones and a jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights since the arrest. His hair was cut short, uneven at the edges where he had trimmed it himself in the mirror of his apartment bathroom. His hands, large, rough, scarred from years of work, were cuffed together in front of him by cold metal restraints. The handcuffs were tight, unforgiving, biting into his wrists with every small movement. He wore the same clothes he had been arrested in. A faded gray factory shirt stained with oil and sweat, work pants worn thin at the knees, steel-toed boots cracked and dulled from years on concrete floors. In a room filled with tailored suits and pressed uniforms, he looked like something dragged in from outside and left where it didn't belong. The sound of metal echoed as he was led forward. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to be heard. Behind him sat the other workers, black men mostly, some young, some older, faces worn by long shifts and low pay. They filled the gallery seats in quiet rows, their bodies stiff, their expressions carefully controlled. One man stared at Caleb with eyes full of pain, his jaw trembling as if words were trying to force their way out. Another kept his head lowered, gaze fixed on his boots, shoulders hunched as though making himself smaller could make the moment pass. Near the back, a younger worker leaned partially behind a column, watching from a distance. Fear sat plainly on his face. Not fear of guilt, but fear of consequence. They had been there that night. Some of them had worked the same shift. Some had seen what wasn't in the reports. Some knew, without question, that Caleb Morris was innocent. But no one stood, no one spoke. Silence filled the courtroom, thick and heavy like something learned long ago and carried quietly ever since. This was how it worked. In Riverton, injustice was not shocking. It was familiar. Caleb felt it pressing down on him, not just the weight of the cuffs, but the weight of being seen and not defended. He did not look back at them again. He already knew what he would find there. At the front of the room sat Judge Richard Holloway. Holloway was a white man in his early 50s, heavy-set with broad shoulders and thinning gray hair combed neatly to the side. His face was round, his cheeks full, and his expression carefully neutral. Years on the bench had trained him well. How to look calm, detached, as though judgment were merely a function, not a choice. He wore a black judicial robe that stretched across his frame as he sat behind the elevated bench, hands folded, eyes forward. Nothing in his posture suggested urgency. Nothing suggested doubt. To him, this was procedure. To Caleb, it was everything. At the defense table sat Thomas Green. Green was 38, white, slim, with slightly hunched shoulders that made him appear smaller than he was. His suit was dark, but wrinkled. The fabric creased at the elbows as if it had been slept in. His tie sat crooked, hastily retied. Thin-framed glasses rested on his nose, and behind them were tired eyes, sharp but worn. He was a public defender, assigned, not chosen. He had met Caleb twice, long enough to know the man in front of him did not fit the story being built, but not long enough to feel confident that belief would be enough. Green believed in evidence. He believed in process. He also knew how rarely either one saved men like Caleb Morris. Across the room, at the prosecution table, stood Mark Reynolds. Reynolds was 45, tall, clean-shaven with neatly styled dark blonde hair and cold blue eyes. His suit was expensive, perfectly tailored, his posture upright and composed. He carried himself with the ease of a man who trusted the system, not because it was fair, but because it worked for him. He glanced at Caleb briefly, not with anger or malice, but with something worse. Certainty, as if the conclusion had already been reached. Caleb swallowed, his throat dry. His heart beat hard against his ribs. He clasped his cuffed hands together, fingers interlocking around the chain, grounding himself. He thought of his mother, Sarah Morris. Sarah was 58, tall and slender, her posture slightly stooped from years of physical labor that had taken more than it gave. Her dark brown skin was marked by soft wrinkles, especially around her mouth, lines formed by worry, restraint, and long-held silence. Her hair was worn short and natural, streaked heavily with gray. Her eyes were warm brown, kind but often clouded with concern. Sarah had been a gentle woman for as long as most people remembered her. Quiet, polite, always apologizing even when she had done nothing wrong. She had not always been that way. Years ago, when Caleb was 12, his father had died in a factory accident. Faulty equipment, a brief investigation, no one held accountable. After that day, Sarah changed. Her voice softened. Her opinions stayed unspoken. She learned that survival often depended on not being noticed. That lesson had shaped her, and her son. As Caleb stood in the center of the courtroom, he imagined Sarah sitting alone in apartment 17, hands folded at the table, praying quietly in the way she always did when fear outweighed hope. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The room rose, then sat. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor seemed unnaturally loud. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file in front of him. "State versus Caleb Morris," he said evenly. "This court is convened." Caleb lifted his eyes. For a brief moment he searched the gallery again, hoping irrationally that someone might stand, that someone might speak, that one voice could break the rule that had governed them all for so long. No one moved. The workers remained seated, silent, accepting. The injustice did not arrive with violence. It arrived with permission. Caleb understood it then with painful clarity. This silence was not empty. It was chosen, and it would follow him wherever he was taken next. When Caleb was taken into custody, apartment 17 did not fall apart all at once. It hollowed out slowly. The space itself was small, 2 narrow rooms tucked into a tired brick building a few blocks from the courthouse. The walls were clean but worn, painted over too many times. The kitchen table sat close to the kitchenette, its surface scarred by years of use. That night, a single overhead light hummed faintly, casting a dull yellow glow over an untouched dinner. Sarah Morris sat at the table, her back straight despite the thin wooden chair pressing into her spine. She was a tall, slender black woman, nearly 58, with a posture shaped by decades of physical labor and restraint. Her shoulders sloped slightly forward, not from weakness but from habit, cleaning houses, lifting buckets, carrying the weight of responsibility without complaint. Her hair was worn short and natural, threaded heavily with gray. Her face was long and gentle, lined softly around the mouth and eyes, lines that deepened when she worried. She worried often. The plate in front of her had gone cold. Soup skin had formed on the surface, untouched. Sarah had cooked out of instinct, muscle memory guiding her hands even though she knew Caleb would not walk through the door. She stared at the bowl, as if waiting for it to explain what came next. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Each second felt deliberate. The rent notice lay folded beside the salt shaker. She had opened it earlier, read it twice, then folded it again with care, as if neatness might soften its meaning. Electricity, water, gas, expenses that had once been divided, absorbed quietly by two incomes stretched thin but steady. Now they pressed down on her alone. Sarah rose slowly and carried the bowl to the sink. She rinsed it without eating, hands steady, movements controlled. Control had become her way of surviving. After her husband's death years ago, another factory accident that ended in paperwork instead of accountability, she had learned that emotion changed nothing. Silence, routine, and endurance had kept her afloat. She had passed those lessons to her son without meaning to. Now those lessons sat heavily in the air. She walked down the narrow hallway and stopped at Caleb's bedroom. The door stood half open. Inside, the room smelled faintly of machine oil and worn fabric. His work jacket hung over the back of a chair, reflective strips dulled with grime. His boots sat by the wall, toes scuffed, laces loose as he had left them after his last shift. Sarah reached out and touched the jacket sleeve with 2 fingers. The fabric was stiff, still holding the shape of his arm. She closed her eyes briefly, then let her hand fall. She did not cry. Crying, she had learned, exhausted you without solving anything. A soft movement came from the corner of the apartment. Milo, the gray tabby cat, lay curled on the radiator, his slim, aging body tucked into a tight circle. He was at least 12 years old, his fur mottled gray with a white patch on his chest, his green eyes cloudy with age. Milo had been Caleb's doing, found years ago behind the steel plant dumpsters, thin and limping. Sarah had protested at first. Another mouth to feed, another responsibility, but Milo had stayed, quiet and observant, moving through the apartment as if aware that noise invited trouble. He lifted his head now, blinking slowly at Sarah. His tail flicked once, deliberate. Sarah crossed the room and ran a hand gently along his back. His fur was warm beneath her palm. The simple, living presence grounded her more than anything else in the room. "It's just us tonight," she murmured, though she wasn't sure why she spoke aloud. Milo leaned into her touch, then settled again, satisfied. Later that evening, Sarah sat back at the table with a stack of papers spread carefully before her. Pay stubs, old receipts, a notebook where she kept dates and numbers written in neat, precise handwriting. She added columns, subtracted totals, paused, recalculated. The numbers did not bend to hope. She would need help. The thought made her uncomfortable. Sarah had spent a lifetime avoiding attention, believing that asking too much invited scrutiny, and scrutiny rarely came without consequences. Still, she reached for her phone. The public defender's office number was written on a scrap of paper in her pocket. She dialed. The line rang and rang, then clicked to voicemail. Sarah ended the call without leaving a message. She waited a moment, then tried again. The result was the same. She set the phone down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. Outside, the hallway echoed with distant footsteps. Neighbors returning home, doors opening and closing. Normally, those sounds blended into the background. Tonight, each one felt sharp, intrusive. A knock came at the door. Sarah froze. The knock came again, light, uncertain. She stood and opened the door halfway. A woman from the next apartment stood in the hallway, white, early 30s, average height, wrapped in a cardigan pulled tight around her torso. Her hair was tied back, her eyes shifting past Sarah into the apartment, then back again. She held herself stiffly, as if bracing for something unpleasant. "I heard about your son," the woman said quietly. "I'm sorry." Sarah nodded once. "Thank you." The woman hesitated, then cleared her throat. "The landlord's been asking questions about how long you'll be staying." The words were carefully chosen. The meaning was not. "I don't plan on leaving," Sarah replied gently. The woman's mouth tightened into a polite, strained smile. "Of course, I just thought you should know." She stepped back quickly, relief plain on her face as the door closed between them. Sarah leaned her forehead briefly against the wood. Then she straightened, smoothed her sweater, and returned to the table. Across town, in a small consultation room at the courthouse, Thomas Green sat alone with a legal pad in front of him. The overhead light buzzed softly. Green removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. He looked younger without the frames, more uncertain. He had reviewed the case file again, and again. There was still nothing. No fingerprints, no weapon, no clear timeline. Just assumptions layered into official language. He knew how this worked. He had seen it before. Cases built not on proof, but on convenience. Still, this one unsettled him. Caleb Morris did not fit the pattern of guilt Green had come to recognize over years of practice. There was no recklessness in the man's past, no history of violence, only work, only routine, only silence. Green exhaled slowly. He was inexperienced compared to prosecutors like Mark Reynolds. He lacked confidence that came from winning, but he had one thing that mattered: doubt. And doubt, properly used, could be dangerous. Back at apartment 17, the night deepened. Streetlights flickered on outside the low windows, casting shadows across the walls. Sarah rose and lit the small lamp by the window, turning off the overhead light. The softer glow made the room feel smaller, safer. She retrieved a framed photograph from the counter and placed it beneath the lamp. Caleb stood in the picture, younger, smiling awkwardly in his work uniform, eyes squinting against the sun. She adjusted the frame carefully until it sat straight. Sarah folded her hands together and sat very still. The apartment no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place waiting for someone who might not return. The family had not shattered in a single moment. It was unraveling quietly through unpaid bills, unanswered calls, and rooms that held the shape of someone missing. And the absence of Caleb Morris pressed down on everything, heavier than any sound. Thomas Green did not look like the kind of lawyer people trusted with their freedom. He was 38, slim to the point of looking underfed, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he had learned to take up as little space as possible. His dark suit had once been tailored, but now carried the soft wrinkles of long days and short nights. A faint shadow lived permanently beneath his eyes, the mark of a man who read files at midnight and woke before dawn with unfinished arguments circling his thoughts. He had been assigned to Caleb Morris's case because no one else wanted it. In the public defender's office, cases like Caleb's were passed along quietly without discussion. They were labeled difficult, a word that really meant unwinnable. Too little evidence to fight, too much assumption to overcome. When Thomas's supervisor slid the file across the desk, she avoided his eyes. "You're up," she said, her tone apologetic but final. Thomas had nodded. He always nodded. The first time he met Caleb in the holding room beneath the courthouse, Thomas noticed the hands before anything else. Large, rough, scarred, hands shaped by steel and repetition. Caleb sat with them folded together, cuffs biting lightly into his wrists, his posture rigid but controlled. He did not look angry. He looked tired. Thomas introduced himself, voice steady. "I'm your attorney," Caleb studied him for a moment. There was no hostility in his gaze, only caution. Years of being careful had taught him not to expect much from strangers, especially those who wore suits and spoke in measured tones. "You believe me?" Caleb asked quietly. The question landed heavier than Thomas expected. "Yes," Thomas replied. He had not hesitated. The word came from somewhere deeper than logic. He believed him in the way one recognizes truth without proof, through posture, restraint, the absence of performance. Caleb nodded once, as if acknowledging something fragile. But belief was not power. Back in the courtroom, Thomas felt it immediately, the shift in the air when he stood. Assistant District Attorney Mark Reynolds barely looked up from his notes. Reynolds was everything Thomas was not. Tall, broad-shouldered, composed with the confidence of a man who had never questioned whether the system worked for him. His tailored suit fit perfectly. His hair was neatly styled, his expression calm and unreadable. When Thomas spoke, Reynolds listened politely, the way one listens to someone whose outcome has already been decided. The jury mirrored that indifference. 12 men and women, mostly white, neatly dressed, seated in comfortable chairs. Some leaned back slightly, arms crossed. Others sat upright, hands folded, faces neutral. None of them looked like Caleb. None of them carried the permanent fatigue of manual labor in their posture. Their eyes moved over Thomas briefly, then drifted elsewhere. He was background noise. Even Judge Richard Holloway, seated high above them all, gave no indication that Thomas's words reached him. Holloway was a heavy-set man in his early 50s, his thinning gray hair carefully combed, his expression disciplined into neutrality. Years on the bench had taught him how to listen without engaging, how to signal patience while withholding interest. Thomas argued carefully. He spoke of the lack of physical evidence, of timelines that did not align, of assumptions presented as conclusions. His voice did not rise. He did not dramatize. He trusted that clarity would matter. It didn't. When he finished, the silence felt clinical, dismissive. As Thomas returned to his seat, he caught sight of Sarah Morris in the gallery. She sat near the aisle, tall and slender even while seated, her coat folded neatly on her lap. Her posture was upright, composed, but her hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles pale. Sarah did not look at Thomas directly. She watched her son. Thomas could not blame her. Sarah had lived too long with disappointment to invest easily in hope. Years earlier, when her husband had died in a factory accident, lawyers had spoken in calm voices and promised answers. The answers never came. What came instead were forms, delays, and quiet suggestions to move on. Since then, Sarah had learned that belief without results was another kind of cruelty. That history sat between her and Thomas now, unspoken but heavy. Outside the courtroom, during a brief recess, Thomas leaned against the hallway wall and closed his eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. His legal pad was filled with notes that felt inadequate. A court clerk passed him without acknowledgement. 2 prosecutors laughed softly near the water fountain. This was a familiar loneliness, the kind that came with choosing work that offered little gratitude and less victory. Thomas straightened when he noticed a young woman seated near the end of the hallway, typing quickly on a laptop balanced on her knees. She was white, in her late 20s, slim, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled loosely back. She wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a neutral jacket, shoes worn for walking rather than appearance. Her posture was alert, contained. Emily Carter. Thomas recognized her name from a handful of bylines he had read over the years. Freelance reporter, known for small stories that made institutions uncomfortable. She looked up briefly as Thomas passed, her eyes sharp, curious. There was no judgment in her gaze, only attention. That unsettled him. Back at apartment 17, Sarah prepared for another evening alone. She moved through the apartment with deliberate calm, washing dishes, folding laundry, feeding Milo. The cat followed her slowly, his aging body stiff but persistent. Milo was observant in the way old animals often were, as if he understood that something fundamental had shifted. Sarah paused at the window, watching neighbors pass outside without looking up. She felt the weight of their avoidance, the way distance formed without words. It reminded her of the months after her husband's death, when people stopped asking questions and started whispering instead. She wondered if Thomas Green understood what he was walking into, if he knew how easily systems closed ranks, how quietly truth could be buried under procedure. She wanted to trust him. She did not know how. That night, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with the case file open before him. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished. A single lamp cast light over stacks of legal texts and handwritten notes. He reread the police report slowly, line by line. Something bothered him. The report was clean. Too clean. Timelines smoothed over. Witness statements summarized rather than quoted. It felt less like documentation and more like presentation. Thomas wrote a single word at the top of the page. Why? He did not yet know the answer, only that the truth was being avoided with intention. He closed the file and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. He had no reputation to protect him, no political connections, no victories to silence doubt. If he pushed too hard, he would be dismissed as inexperienced. If he stayed quiet, Caleb would disappear into the system like so many others. Thomas understood the risk, but he also understood the cost of silence. Across town, Caleb lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling of his cell. He thought about the young lawyer with tired eyes who believed him without asking for proof. He did not know if belief would be enough. But it was something. And for now, it was all either of them had. The jury did not look at Caleb Morris as a man standing on the edge of losing his life. They looked at him as a problem that needed closing. 12 jurors sat in 2 neat rows, all white, dressed in muted colors that blended into the polished wood of the courtroom. Their faces were not cruel. That was what unsettled Caleb the most. There was no hatred there, no open hostility, only distance. The kind of distance people used when they had already made peace with an outcome that did not affect them personally. They did not see his mother's hands trembling in the gallery. They did not see the years carved into his posture by steel and exhaustion. They saw a file. Mark Reynolds rose with practiced ease. He moved as though the room belonged to him, his confidence quiet and unforced. At 45, he had learned how to let authority do the work for him. Tall, clean-cut, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, Reynolds carried himself like a man who had never doubted which side of the room he belonged on. He did not shout. He did not accuse loudly. He told a story about anger, about resentment, about a poor factory worker who argued with his supervisor and stayed late the night that supervisor died. Reynolds spoke as if arranging familiar objects on a table, each one placed exactly where the jury expected it to be. He did not dwell on evidence. He did not need to. The absence of proof became irrelevant once the narrative felt complete. "This case," he said calmly, "is not about perfection. It is about common sense." Caleb felt his shoulders tighten. Common sense, Reynolds implied, meant that a man like Caleb Morris fit too neatly into the role of the guilty. He had the motive. He had the proximity. And most importantly, he had no power to disrupt the conclusion. Thomas Green stood to object once, then thought better of it. He could feel the room resisting him before he even spoke. The judge's expression remained neutral, his head tilted slightly as if listening, but not leaning in. Judge Richard Holloway had perfected that posture over decades. Heavy-set, broad-shouldered, his thinning gray hair carefully combed, he looked every bit the symbol of restraint and order. His black robe hung heavy against the bench, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tone of reason that discouraged challenge. "The jury will decide," Holloway said, gently but firmly, as though the matter were already settled. Thomas sat back down, jaw clenched. Caleb glanced briefly toward the gallery. His mother, Sarah Morris, sat upright, her tall, slender frame rigid with effort. She had dressed carefully that morning in modest, pressed clothing, as if respectability might still serve as protection. Her face was calm, practiced, but her eyes betrayed the strain. She had lived long enough to recognize moments that could not be undone. Beside her, no one spoke. The deliberation did not take long. From the holding room, Caleb waited, hands cuffed loosely in front of him, the metal cold against his skin. The room smelled of disinfectant and old paint. He stared at the wall, counting cracks without really seeing them. He had expected fear. What he felt instead was a hollow certainty. When the bailiff came for him, Caleb stood without resistance. Back in the courtroom, the jurors filed in. Some avoided looking at him. Others glanced briefly, then looked away. No one met his eyes long enough to see a person. The foreperson, a middle-aged man with neatly trimmed hair and a polite expression, stood. The words came out measured and final. Guilty. Not because the evidence demanded it, not because the truth had been proven, but because the story fit too well to challenge. Sarah inhaled sharply, her hands tightened together, nails pressing into skin. She did not cry. Crying had never saved anyone. Thomas felt something inside him go still. Not shock, he had known this was coming, but a colder realization. This was not a failure of argument. It was a function of design. The judge thanked the jury for their service. Service. Caleb was sentenced to a long-term prison term, the number spoken with bureaucratic ease. Years reduced to digits. A life measured and sealed. As officers stepped forward to escort him away, Caleb turned once more toward the gallery. His eyes met his mother's. Sarah nodded, a small, controlled motion, the same one she had used when he was a child and afraid. It was meant to say, "Survive." Behind her, Thomas stood frozen, papers still in his hands. He felt the weight of the system settle around him, heavy and indifferent. He had believed truth mattered more than narrative. He was learning how expensive that belief was. As Caleb was led out, murmurs filled the room. Not outrage, not protest, just quiet acceptance. The kind that allowed injustice to pass unchallenged. Outside, Riverton went on as it always had. Cars moved. The factory hummed in the distance. Life continued uninterrupted. The verdict had been delivered, but the truth had not been heard. Thomas Green did not sleep the night after the verdict. The courtroom's finality clung to him, replaying in fragments. The jurors' blank faces, the judge's steady tone, the sound of the gavel sealing a future he had failed to protect. By dawn, he was back at his desk, suit jacket draped over the chair, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on the case file he had promised himself he would never close. He started where no one else had bothered to look. The older police reports, scanned, poorly indexed, half forgotten, were buried beneath layers of summaries and conclusions. Thomas read slowly, deliberately, searching not for answers, but for inconsistencies. He circled times that didn't align, names that appeared once and never again. Near the bottom of a supplemental report, a line caught his attention. Male transient observed near rear access road during night shift. No name, no follow-up, no signature. Thomas leaned back, fingers pressed against his temples. In cases like Caleb's, anything left vague was rarely accidental. He pulled the report closer and traced the margin notes with his eyes. There it was. Another reference, even smaller. Initial statement collected. Determined non-credible. Excluded. Excluded by whom and why? He closed the file and stood, pacing the narrow length of his office. Outside, the city was waking. Traffic rolled past. People headed to work. Life moved forward without waiting for justice to catch up. By mid-morning, Thomas was under the bridge. The encampment was a sprawl of tarps, shopping carts, and damp cardboard tucked against concrete pillars stained by years of runoff. The air smelled of oil and river water. A few people watched him approach with practiced suspicion. Lawyers rarely came here unless they wanted something. He spotted the man from the report by description alone. Thin, stooped, wrapped in a frayed coat several sizes too big. The man's hair was gray and tangled, his beard uneven, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into his face. He moved with the cautious alertness of someone used to being chased away. "Are you Marcus?" Thomas asked gently. The man hesitated, then nodded once. His voice, when he spoke, was rough but steady. "Depends who's asking." Thomas introduced himself, keeping his tone calm, his hands visible. "I'm a lawyer. I'm working on a case connected to the steel plant." Marcus's eyes flicked toward the river, then back. He shifted his weight, wary. "I already talked to the police," Marcus said. "They didn't like what I said." "What did you say?" Thomas asked. Marcus exhaled slowly. "That I saw a man leaving the back road that night. Not the one they arrested. Someone cleaner, younger, didn't look like he belonged on a night shift." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Marcus continued, voice dropping. "I gave a statement. They wrote it down. Then they told me I must be confused. Said I drink too much. Said if I kept talking I'd have problems." "Did you recognize the man?" Thomas asked. Marcus shook his head. "No. But I know what I saw." Thomas believed him. Back at the office, the first call came before noon. A blocked number. A man's voice, calm, impersonal. "You're digging where you shouldn't," it said. "Let the case rest." Thomas hung up without responding. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the phone down. He told himself it meant he was close. The second call came an hour later. This one was sharper, less patient. "Your client has already been sentenced," the voice said. "Dragging this up won't help him. Or you." That evening, Thomas went to see Sarah Morris. She opened the door to apartment 17 with the same quiet composure she carried everywhere now. Tall, slender, her posture controlled but tired, Sarah listened without interruption as Thomas explained what he had found. Milo, the gray tabby, watched from the radiator, tail flicking once as if sensing tension. "A witness," Sarah said softly. They ignored him. "Yes," Thomas replied, "and now they're trying to erase him." Sarah nodded slowly. This was familiar. Too familiar. She had seen it after her husband's death. The way responsibility dissolved into paperwork. The way inconvenient truths were labeled unreliable. "Will it help Caleb?" she asked. "I don't know," Thomas said honestly, "but it's the truth." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Then don't stop." The next day, Marcus changed his story. Thomas learned from a police update pushed quietly into the system. Witness recants prior statement. Claims confusion. No longer asserts alternate suspect presence. When Thomas tracked Marcus down again, the man would not meet his eyes. "They came back," Marcus muttered. "Said they'd lock me up for trespassing. Said they'd take what little I got." "Marcus," Thomas said carefully, "did they threaten you?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He nodded once. That afternoon, an internal memo surfaced, unsigned, stating that early reports contained clerical errors. Times adjusted. Descriptions corrected. The system smoothing itself clean. Thomas understood then. They were not hiding the truth because it was unclear. They were hiding it because it was inconvenient. At the courthouse, he tried to file a motion. It stalled in administrative review. At the police department, he requested access to the original recordings. He was told they could not be located. Across town, Emily Carter sat at a small table in a coffee shop, her laptop open, notes spread around her. She had been following the case from the beginning, unsettled by how quickly it had closed. When she heard rumors of a recanted witness, she began pulling public records, timelines, patrol logs. Patterns emerged. She noticed how certain officers' names appeared repeatedly near cases that ended quickly, how reports were revised days after submission, how stories aligned too neatly with conclusions already announced. Emily circled a name on her notepad, then another. She leaned back, eyes narrowing. This wasn't sloppiness, it was coordination. That night, Thomas received another call. This time, the threat was explicit. "Walk away," the voice said, "or you'll regret staying." Thomas stared at the dark window of his apartment after the call ended. His reflection looked older than it had weeks ago. He thought of Caleb sitting in a cell, counted away from life. He thought of Sarah eating alone beneath a dim lamp. He thought of Marcus, silenced by fear. He knew what they were asking him to do, and he knew he couldn't. By morning, Thomas had made a decision, not yet a strategy, not yet a plan, but a refusal. The truth existed. It had witnesses, however fragile. It had records, however altered. It had patterns that could be traced, but it would not surface quietly. As Thomas gathered the files into a single folder, he understood the cost. He was no longer just a young, inexperienced lawyer with a losing case. He was a problem, and problems in systems like this were dealt with. Caleb Morris sat on the narrow bunk in his cell, his back against the cold concrete wall, unaware that outside those walls, a quiet struggle was unfolding in his name. The detention center was built to erase time. Days measured by trays slid through slots, nights broken by footsteps and fluorescent hum. Caleb had learned to sit still, hands folded loosely, breathing slow. Silence had become survival. He thought often of his mother. Sarah Morris moved through life with a careful grace, born of loss. Tall and slender, her posture slightly stooped from years of labor, she carried herself as if attention were dangerous. After her husband died in a factory accident years earlier, something in her had hardened. Not into bitterness, but into restraint. She had learned that speaking up did not guarantee protection. Since Caleb's arrest, that restraint had been tested daily. She visited when she could, her face calm, her eyes carrying the weight of everything she did not say. Caleb did not know that Thomas Green stood at a crossroads. Thomas's office felt smaller now. The walls were lined with case files that suddenly looked like warnings rather than work. He sat at his desk, shoulders hunched, suit jacket draped over the chair, staring at the folder that held Marcus's initial statement, the one that had been quietly erased. Thomas was not a man built for confrontation. Slim, thoughtful, his instinct had always been to reason rather than force. But the calls had changed something in him. The latest message had been brief. No threats this time. Just a reminder. "You're making a mistake." Thomas understood what it meant. Continue, and you become the problem. Disappear quietly and the system forgets you. He thought of Caleb's hands in cuffs, of Sarah's steady nod in the gallery, of Marcus's eyes darting to the shadows beneath the bridge. He knew what walking away would do. It would close the file. It would confirm the verdict. It would teach him how to survive in this profession by choosing safety over truth. Thomas opened his laptop and began copying files, old reports, revised timelines, metadata that showed when changes had been made. He saved them twice, to different drives. He sent a brief email to a contact he trusted only marginally, attaching nothing, saying only, "If something happens to me, you'll know where to look." Across town, Emily Carter leaned forward over her laptop in a dim coffee shop that stayed open late for courthouse staff and night shift workers. She had chosen the corner seat by habit, back to the wall, eyes on the room. Emily was 28, slim, with an alert posture that made her seem taller than she was. Her brown hair was pulled back loosely, strands falling free as she worked. She dressed for movement, not impression. Emily had learned early that systems told stories about themselves. Her job was to read what they avoided saying. She had mapped patrol routes, cross-referenced shift logs, and compared original police reports with their amended versions. Patterns emerged like faint bruises beneath the skin. Times adjusted by minutes. Names appearing once, then vanishing. Witness statements summarized instead of quoted. It was not chaos. It was maintenance. A new name surfaced again in the margins. An officer who had signed off on multiple revisions. A quiet presence, rarely quoted, often decisive. Emily leaned back, fingers steepled, heart beating faster. This was not just about Caleb Morris anymore. It was about how quickly a system could close ranks when exposed. Her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. "Be careful. You're asking the wrong questions." Emily stared at the screen, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. She had expected this. The warning confirmed what she already knew. That evening, Sarah sat at the small table in apartment 17, the lamp casting a warm circle of light over the wood. Milo, the gray tabby cat Caleb had rescued years ago, slept curled on the radiator, his breathing slow and steady. Milo was old now, 12 at least, his cloudy green eyes missing little despite his age. He had become Sarah's quiet companion in the long hours after Caleb's arrest. Sarah folded a letter she had written to Caleb and set it beside the framed photograph of him in his work uniform. She had chosen her words carefully, avoiding despair, offering strength instead. She did not mention the landlord's calls or the neighbors who no longer met her eyes. She did not mention the fear that crept in at night. She prayed, as she always had, not for miracles, but for endurance. Back in his cell, Caleb lay down and stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks he had memorized. He wondered if truth was something people found, or something they decided to allow. He wondered how many people had watched injustice pass them by because intervening felt dangerous. He had done it himself more times than he liked to admit. He did not know that Emily had printed a set of documents and slid them into a folder she kept close to her body. He did not know that Thomas had refused to delete a file when told it contained errors. He only knew that tomorrow would come, as it always did. Late that night, Thomas stepped outside his apartment to find a man waiting near his car. The man was unremarkable. Average height, neutral expression, hands in his pockets. He spoke softly as if offering advice. "You're talented," the man said. "Don't ruin your future over a lost cause." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Justice isn't a cause," he replied. "It's a responsibility." The man studied him for a moment, then shrugged and walked away. Thomas stood there long after the footsteps faded. He understood now that there would be no turning back without consequences. The next morning, Emily requested additional records through public channels. The response came faster than expected. Denied. No explanation. She smiled thinly. Denials were admissions, when you knew how to read them. She packed her bag and left the cafe, choosing the long route back, watching reflections in windows. She felt the familiar weight of a decision pressing down. Publish too early, and the story would be dismissed. Wait too long, and the truth would be buried beneath procedure. At the detention center, Caleb was called for mail. He received Sarah's letter and held it carefully, reading slowly. Her handwriting was neat, controlled. At the end, she had written, "Stay with me. We will endure." Caleb folded the letter and placed it beneath his pillow. As evening settled over Riverton, clouds pressed low against the skyline, the steel plant's distant hum a reminder of the town's heart. The courthouse stood quiet, columns pale under streetlights, serene and sealed. Inside, files rested in cabinets, their revisions invisible to the public eye. The truth was there. It existed in fragments, memories, erased statements, altered timestamps, It waited for someone willing to gather it and accept the cost. Thomas sat at his desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Emily stood beneath a street lamp, folder held close. Sarah watched the street from her window. Caleb closed his eyes in his cell. The truth was being smothered. But it was not yet dead. As the story pauses here, it does not end inside a courtroom or behind prison walls. It lingers in places we all recognize. In moments when we stay silent at work to protect our jobs. In days when we look away because speaking up feels too costly. In quiet decisions where survival seems safer than truth. Caleb's story is not only about a man in handcuffs. It is about how easily ordinary people can become invisible when a system decides they are convenient. It is about families who lose their pillars without headlines. It is about how truth often survives only because someone, somewhere, refuses to let it disappear. In real life, justice rarely arrives loudly. Sometimes it comes slowly. Sometimes it comes late. And sometimes it only comes because one person chooses courage over comfort. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe and follow the channel so you do not miss what happens next. The next chapter may be closer to reality than we think. May God protect every viewer who has ever felt unheard. May He strengthen those who stand alone. And may truth find its voice even in the quiet. If you believe in justice, in courage, and in light breaking through silence, comment Amen.